So today, we're pleased to continue our panel discussions around Vision 2030 and it's the geography of innovation is the theme. The May panel on the geography of federal funding will shed light on the federal funding landscape across the nation. You know, some of us are very familiar with the federal funding that comes out of NSF, but we may not be familiar about, for example, what does the Department of Commerce do? What does, for example, the Department of Education do? What does EPA actually do in terms of economic development? So this funding across the nation, individual states, and across institutional types. So with that, I'm very happy to say that I'm going to turn this over to Roger Beachy, who's put a lot of effort to lead this on. Roger?
Thanks, Vic. And I'm pleased to introduce a panel that will help us understand more about where we are in this challenge of distributing innovation education across the nation. Welcome to our panel on the geography of federal R&D funding. Before we start, I'd like to remind you to, as board members and others in attendance, to please turn off your cameras and mute your microphones during the presentation so that we have fewer interference opportunities. Today's speakers will continue our panel series about the geography of innovation and ensuring that every American has the opportunity to participate in the S&E enterprise, which requires the access to STEM education, innovation hubs and research institutions, and the associated financial investments required to build that enterprise. I'm privileged to be part of a subcommittee at the OSTP on looking at opportunities and examples of the expansion of hubs around the nation that other agencies have developed and how their impacts of those in different parts of our innovation industry. That's why I was so pleased when our former national board chair, José-Marie Griffiths, agreed to moderate today's panel. And good morning, José-Marie. She's president at Dakota State University in Madison, South Dakota. She has played a key role in the federal S&D space, not just on the board, but also as a previous board member, but also as part of the U.S. President's Information Technology Advisory Committee and the U.S. National Commission on Libraries and Information Science. As Dakota State University President, José-Marie has overseen growth of applied research and development, entered in partnerships with corporate and non-for-profits, as well as with government agencies and organizations, and has participated in the state, regional, and national conversation around workforce and economic development. Her many experiences add much to our knowledge and provides a background for this panel. She also hosted one of the board's listening sessions on her campus 3 years ago when we were developing Vision 2030, when I had a chance to meet Dr. Griffiths. So José-Marie, thank you for moderating today's panel. We are looking forward to the presentations and a robust discussion that will indeed follow. So I'll turn this over to you, José-Marie.
Thank you, Roger. As NSB highlighted in Vision 2030 and its recently released Keystone Policy Brief, access for every American to the science and engineering enterprise is essential to enhance our national security, maintain our global standing in innovation and technological developments, and capture the full breadth of American diversity of thought. The topic of today's panel is also extremely timely. Expanding the science and engineering capacity across the US and within states is not only a priority of the board, but also a priority of Congress, the administration, and NSF. There are multiple views on how best to do that. And the goal of today's panel is to bring to light the complexities of an uneven geography of federal R&D funding, and to frame the problem in ways beyond simple dichotomies. The data and insights from our panelists will show the variety of barriers and opportunities to building the science and engineering capacity, both across the country and within states. Today's panel builds on the last three panels. In August, you heard how community colleges are essential for talent development in their communities. In December, panelists shared data on the uneven geography of K through 12 STEM education in the United States. And this past February, you heard from experts about what is required to build successful innovation partnerships. Today's panelists will discuss the geography of federal R&D funding, an essential component to building US R&D capacity. Each panelist will speak for 5 minutes, after which we will have a Q&A session. Our first panelist is Marcy Gallo. Marcy is an analyst in science and technology policy at the Congressional Research Service in DC. She focuses on a broad range of science and technology issues, including federally funded research and development centers, federal prices, defense research and development, and technology development and innovation. And today, Marcy will open our panel with a data-rich review of the federal R&D landscape across the entire nation. Our second panelist, Roger Wakimoto, may be familiar to some of you as the former NSF Assistant Director for Geosciences. Roger is a strong advocate for R&D spending for a wide variety of institution types. He's currently the Vice Chancellor for Research and Creative Activities at the University of California, Los Angeles. Roger also chairs the Association of Public Land-Grant Universities Council on Research. He will speak today on how R&D dollars are distributed within states. Our third panelist is Cecilia Orphan, Director of Partnerships at the Alliance for Research on Regional Colleges and an Associate Professor of Higher Education at the University of Denver. Her research looks at how regional public universities and rural serving institutions promote equity and community well-being, and she'll speak today about their role in closing geographic research deserts. Our final panelist is Anna Quidder. Anna is the Assistant Vice President for Federal Relations for Northern Illinois University. She's Vice Chair of the American Physical Society Forum on Physics and Society, past President of the Science Coalition, and has held numerous leadership roles within the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities Council on Government Affairs. Anna will be talking about emerging research institutions and the vital role they play in the US science and engineering enterprise. At the end of the presentation, we will invite board members to turn their cameras back on and start the Q&A. I'll now turn to Marcy to start her presentation. Marcy?
Thank you very much. As you know, Congress has long been concerned about the distribution of federal science and engineering funding. Some members are focused on ensuring that R&D funding is allocated across the country as a whole, while others are focused on its distribution to groups underrepresented in STEM. Next slide, please. To start off today's panel and our discussion, I'm going to show you a series of maps to provide a common understanding of the geography of federal research and development funding. This first map shows the distribution of federal R&D obligations from fiscal year 2011 through 2019. The darker the shading, the more funding the state received. 13 states from Washington up on that list to your right, ranked within the top 10 at least once, and 14 states from Nebraska down, ranked in the bottom 10 at least once. The top 2 states, California and Maryland, accounted for between 24% and 29% of federal R&D funding each year. The top 10 states accounted for between 55% and 64% of federal R&D obligations, and the bottom 10 states accounted for around 1% of federal R&D funding each year. One caveat to note is that there is a portion of federal R&D obligations each year that is not tied to a specific state or location. That is, the federal agency is not reporting the place where the R&D is performed. This undistributed amount varied between 1% and 15% of federal R&D obligations between 2011 and 2019. Next slide, please. Here, we're going to focus in on fiscal year 2019. The top left map shows the distribution of federal R&D obligations overall. The rest of the maps show the distribution of federal R&D obligations by R&D performer type. I've lumped R&D performed by federal scientists and FFRDCs together because the work is occurring in government-owned facilities. That's the map in the top middle. Next is the distribution of federal R&D obligations performed by industry, then by universities and colleges, other nonprofits, and state and local governments. Most federal R&D is performed by federal scientists, industry, or university researchers. The rank of some states stays the same regardless of R&D performer, for example, California. However, the rank of other states vary by R&D performer. For example, if we look at New Mexico, we see that it ranks in the middle or at the bottom of all R&D performer types, except the intramural FFRDC category, where it's in the top 10. This suggests that the national labs are the primary driver of federal research investments in the state. If we look at Connecticut and Florida, we see that these states only rank in the top 10 in federal R&D performed by industry. And in a final example, if we look at Georgia and Michigan, we see that these states only rank in the top 10 for R&D performed by universities and colleges. If the National Science Board intends to expand the geography of innovation, it may need a variety of policies and programs depending on the needs and relative strengths of a given state. Next slide, please. Now I want to focus in on the distribution of federal science and engineering obligations by institution type. As expected, R1 institutions account for the largest share of the $34 billion to universities, colleges, and nonprofits in fiscal year 2019 at nearly 76%. High enrollment Hispanic institutions accounted for approximately 13%. Four-year institutions with a special focus on medicine or other technical areas accounted for about 10%. R2 institutions for 7%. Minority serving institutions for 3%, and HBCUs for less than 1%. It's important to note that some institutions fall under more than one classification, and as such, their data is included in multiple categories. For example, the University of New Mexico is an R1 institution, a high enrollment Hispanic institution, and a minority serving institution. Additionally, Morehouse School of Medicine is a four-year special focus institution, an HBCU, and a minority serving institution. Thank you very much. That concludes my remarks. I'll hand things over to Roger.
Thank you, Marcy, appreciate it. Now we'll turn to Cecilia. Oh, I'm sorry, next we have Roger, I apologize. Roger, as soon as your presentation is up, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. Before I start, I just want to salute both Artie, Carl, and Anila, people that I really worked closely together during my time at the National Science Foundation. So with that, I'm going to be talking about federal R&D landscape, states, and focusing in on California. Okay, next slide, please. So this is a map you've already seen before. This is from NCSES of federal R&D funding by state. Pretty easy to understand. Darker green means more funding in that state. The progressively lighter green means less funding. So next slide. So what I've done here, though, is simply superimpose the locations of the R1 universities. Magenta circles represent public, yellow triangles represent private. And although it's not perfect, there is a relationship between states that are darker green and the number of R1 universities in those states. Next slide. So starting to focus in on California, some of this information I didn't even know. We have 35 public institutions that receive federal R&D. We have 35 private institutions that receive support. We have 10 AAU members, Association of American Universities, the so-called elite universities. There are 65 members in AAU. We have 16 APLU members, Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities, 246 members of APLU. Now, if you start looking at what has been defined as an emerging research institution, an ERI, and there are a couple definitions. I've chosen $35 million of R&D support or less. Turns out California has an amazing number of 52. I didn't even know this was that large. 21 are public institutions and 31 are private institutions. So please click, move forward. Let's see, federal funding across the nation. Public institutions receive about $54.8 billion, private institution, and this is in 2019, 28.9, about a 2-to-1 ratio between publics and privates. California largely mimics that, not exactly. Public institutions bring in $7.4 billion of R&D. Private institutions bring in 3.1. And of course, the University of California is a massive system. We bring in 8% of the total R&D funding nationwide. And if you just look at California, we bring in nearly 2/3 of the total funding. So please click. This is diversity. I'm going to talk about this on this slide and also my last slide. I know Ponch refers to the missing million. Turns out 5 of the 10 UCs are Hispanic serving institutions. And UC Davis is literally on the doorstep, and UCLA isn't too far behind. How about the California State Universities, a massive system in California? Nearly all of them are HSIs, 21 out of 23. And one final note, we do have one historically Black graduate institution. It's, for those who don't know, it's Charles Drew University. So next slide. So I'm going to end on some issues, hopefully to stimulate some discussion. Please click. How do we ensure that all emerging research institutes, ERIs across the nation have the potential to increase R&D support? Really the call for the need of geographic diversity. And I want to remind you all something I think you do know, and that is many underrepresented groups attend ERIs. So please click ahead. And how can R1s effectively partner with ERIs in order to strengthen their research programs, including infrastructure? I wanted to share a recent APL use survey from the Council on Research, surveying all senior research officers or SROs. Turned out number 5 in priority was improved partnerships between R1s and R2s with ERIs. Please click. And then again, my last bullet here is on diversity. HSI designation, Hispanic serving designation. 7 of the 65 AAU members are HSI. I think I counted one of the 7th as Davis, since they're literally at the doorstep. Just a reminder that some HSRs are major R1 universities. I'll point you to an article by Stephanie Smith last year, seeking to serve or serve with a $, questioning whether some seek HSI status to tap into federal funding. I want to applaud Barbara Snyder at AAU. She has prioritized at a very high level research partnerships with HBCUs, and I strongly support her in doing that. And lastly, I want to comment very briefly about some legislative proposals, just 2 bullets. One is this one for NSF to pilot partnership programs. In other words, multi-institutional awards that are greater than $1 million must partner with an ERI. And I'll end with use-inspired research versus technology-driven research. I want to just note that in some groups of underrepresented minorities, like for example, Native Americans and tribal colleges, they're much more attracted to use-inspired research because I know they feel very strongly that the research must be brought back to the community to benefit those people in that community. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Roger. We'll now turn to Cecilia.
Regional public universities grant 50% of all bachelor's degrees given by 4-year publics and educate 49% of students of color attending all 4-year publics. RPUs enroll large shares of first-generation college students, veterans, adults, immigrants, and low-income students, and are often their state's most affordable bachelor's degree. This slide shows Colorado's 7 RPUs. You can spot RPUs because their name tells you which communities they serve. University of Northern Colorado, MSU Denver, Western Colorado. In California, they are the 23 CSU campuses. In New York, they're the SUNY and the CUNY schools. RPUs draw students from less than 100 miles away and are geographically distributed to ensure local post-secondary access. They contribute millions of dollars each year to local economies and train business leaders, researchers, teachers, public health professionals, and government officials who remain in the region after graduation. Because RPUs maintain accessible admissions practices, they foster greater upward mobility than any other post-secondary sector. RPUs also serve their communities by conducting applied research. The Alliance for Research on Regional Colleges, or ARC, has found that RPUs are particularly important to rural communities and host small business incubation centers and address employment shortages in those areas. This is a diverse sector. So RPUs span 7 Carnegie classifications. Most are classified as master's degree granting institutions. Most four-year public MSIs were founded as regional public universities, and many RPUs are the emerging research universities that were just discussed that have gained reputations for applied research. RPUs are diverse because they have evolved to serve the unique needs of their students and communities, and no two student bodies and regions need the same things. Please change to the next slide. The next slide, please. Despite these important contributions, RPUs are underfunded relative to other institutional types. In Colorado, RPUs receive 36 cents to every dollar of public funding that goes to our state's land-grant, flagship, and research universities, CU Boulder, CSU Fort Collins, and the School of Mines. This is why the simplest way to answer the question, what is an RPU, is to say that an RPU is whatever its region and students need it to be within the confines created by funding inequities. This graph shows some of the funding disparities. The blue lines are Colorado's R1s and the green lines are RPUs. The lines represent combined public funding across 6 sources, including federal R&D, listed on the slide. RPUs receive on average $9,000 less in public funding per full-time enrollment across these sources. This creates a number of challenges. First, many R1s generate institutional revenue through indirect costs, but RPUs aren't able to do so because they often receive fewer and smaller grants. Because of this, RPUs have underdeveloped research infrastructures. Second, RPUs are teaching focused and often unable to free up faculty time to pursue large grants. Graduate programs are often smaller and in professional fields, which means fewer graduate students to support research. Third, and probably most importantly, federal grants often entail complicated applications, which are difficult for RPUs to complete given staff shortages due to funding inequities and limited faculty time. While some RPUs successfully compete for NSF grants to develop diverse STEM talent, their potential as anchor institutions to support broad regional R&D has been unrealized. Next slide, please. What I want to state emphatically is that there is enormous untapped potential among RPUs to support the National Science Board's goal for the U.S. to remain a leader in innovation. RPUs are poised to deliver the benefits of research to their regions, many of which are rural. RPUs are not ivory towers. They are wholly immersed in their communities. RPUs have regional partnerships that could be better leveraged to produce R&D, but this is currently difficult to realize. Second, RPUs are important leverage points for developing diverse STEM talent. When RPU faculty do research, they often involve undergraduate students who are racially diverse and low income. And with improved funding, RPUs could better support these students in developing in-demand R&D skills. RPUs also train STEM K-12 teachers and conduct applied research to improve K-12 curricula. This is why investing in RPUs translates into significant investments in STEM talent development across the P20 pipeline. Finally, RPUs exist to serve their regions. When we talk about expanding the geography of innovation, there's simply no better way to do so than to leverage the promise of RPUs to partner with regional industries, government agencies, and nonprofit organizations. So how can we do that? For the potential of RPUs to be realized, the barriers to pursuing federal R&D funding must be reduced. Planning and development grants could allow RPUs to develop research infrastructure. Federal agency staff could support RPUs in applying for grants, and federal grants could be tailored to the regional service missions of RPUs. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia. We'll now go over to Anna. Anna, our final panelist.
Thank you. Today, I will discuss emerging research institutions and minority-serving institutions, which are 2 ways to define subsets of higher education institutions based on their research portfolio or student enrollment. Increasing geographic breadth of federal research investments is a consequence of utilizing these definitions. First, I'm going to introduce my home institution for context. Northern Illinois University, known as NIU, is a public regional research university enrolling over 16,500 students in fall of 2020. NIU serves a diverse student body where 79% of undergraduate students are either students of color, Pell Grant recipients, or first-generation college students. NIU's 2020 research portfolio is $25 million in annual research expenditures, including $8 million in federal funding, of which $2.1 million was from the National Science Foundation. NIU is one of 12 public universities located across Illinois, including 9 regional public universities. Next slide, please. Emerging Research Institution, or ERI, is a new definition that encompasses NIU. While the exact definition is still working its way through legislation, the 2 key components are an institution must have an upper limit in the range of $35 million to $50 million for its annual federal research expenditures, and an institution must enroll undergraduate students. ERIs are in every state. Thanks to my colleagues at the American Physical Society for the graphs that I will walk through. These graphs depict an analysis of the 637 institutions that reported federal science and engineering research expenditures in fiscal year 2018. This analysis is helpful for understanding whether federal research investments are reaching a broad cross-section of institutions spanning the United States. Next slide. As shown in graph 1, 139 institutions received 90% of federal research funding, and nearly 500 ERIs collectively received only 10% of federal research funding. Next. Despite receiving nearly all of the nation's research funding that went to higher ed institutions, these top research institutions enroll less than half of all students. Next. And only about 1/3 of underrepresented minority students who attend one of these 637 research active institutions. Comparing graphs 2 and 3 reveals that ERIs enroll proportionally more underrepresented minority students compared to the top research institutions. Next. A nearly identical trend plays out for federal Pell Grant recipients, who are the nation's most financially disadvantaged students. The story these graphs tell is that 2/3 of our nation's underrepresented minority students or Pell Grant recipients attend research active institutions that see only about 10% of federal research dollars on their campuses. Fewer federal research dollars on campus means fewer campus-based research opportunities for students, many of whom are place-bound and cannot leave their community to pursue research opportunities. Participation in research is considered a high-impact practice for student retention and graduation and workforce preparation. The concentration of federal research support in a small number of the nation's higher education institutions presents a structural impediment to geographic diversification of the STEM talent pipeline. Next. The Minority Serving Institution, or MSI designation, refers to the higher education institutions that meet the eligibility criteria for a suite of programs at the U.S. Department of Education. Over the course of decades, new categories of MSIs were created to direct resources to institutions serving specific types of minority students who attend low-cost institutions with high enrollment or financially needy students. Intentionality and care are essential when utilizing MSI definitions outside of their original context. As is the case with all definitions, there are limitations to the MSI designation, as I'll explain. Shown here are the minimum enrollment thresholds for various race ethnicities which correspond to MSI programs. For example, eligibility for the Hispanic Serving Institution program requires a minimum undergraduate enrollment of 25% Hispanic students, and eligibility for the predominantly Black institution program requires a minimum undergraduate enrollment of 40% Black students. Next slide. The most recent student enrollment data shows that there are institutions where over 50% of undergraduates are students of color, yet they are not MSI eligible. This includes 199 institutions that don't meet the minimum race ethnicity enrollment thresholds and 159 institutions that meet the race and ethnicity thresholds, but don't meet the cost or needy student criteria. Most of these excluded institutions are ERIs. Next slide. Presented here are the undergraduate enrollment data for Northern Illinois University and UNC Greensboro, 2 ERIs, which are not MSI eligible despite being minority majority institutions. The Department of Education offers a waiver program for institutions that do not meet the needy student criteria or the cost of attendance criteria, but there is no process for securing a waiver for an institution that serves a high percentage of students of color, yet does not meet the minimum threshold of enrollment for a specific race or ethnicity group. A number of current or proposed programs by the NSF, other federal agencies, and the administration that seek to expand race, ethnicity, diversity in STEM gives preference to or are only open to federally designated MSIs. Yet the MSI designation is not capturing the full spectrum of institutions that serve a high percentage of students of color, including NIU. Thank you for your time today, and back to you, Dr. Griffiths.
José-Marie, you're still muted.
Oh, sorry about that. Yes, I'd like to thank our exceptional panelists for sharing their data and insights with us this morning. Thanking our panelists for sharing their data and insights. Their slides will be available on the NSB's website, as will a video of this panel session. So let's start the Q&A. I'd like to ask the board members to please turn on their videos and then raise your virtual hand when you have a question. Okay. Anyone have a question? Mel, please, I think you're the first to put your hand up.
For me, I guess.
Okay. Do you have any data indicating distribution of fields here? Physics, chemistry, agriculture?
So the NSF does, the NCSCS does have some data by fields. I don't believe it's broken down by state though. So if you're looking for that geography, I don't recall that they break the field data also down by location.
Okay. Next I have Suresh B.
So thank you very much. I don't know any one of the panelists can answer this question, because one of the things indicated was the FFRDCs also get majority of the funding, and how do they get distributed to other universities once they arrive in these national labs? Is there any granularity of the data available so that we can see how the FFRDCs are playing a role in working with the HBCUs and MSIs and other universities too?
So go ahead.
Go ahead, Roger.
I was going to say I was former director of the National Center for Atmospheric Research, so that's an FFRDC. That data is available because it is run by a university consortium, but we don't have access to it right now, but that could be easily gotten because they keep very, very detailed statistics about how the money is distributed and serving the university community.
Thank you.
Marcy, did you want to comment on that?
I was just going to say from sort of the broader perspective about, agencies reporting, money going to FFRDCs, the granularity may or may not be there depending on the federal agency. And so sort of the ability for the board to get some insight into sort of money that flows through FFRDCs and then back out, I think it's really going to depend on the agency. And so that could be a challenge.
Thank you very much.
I noticed during the presentations that we had an active comment session. Dan, you put up an interesting comment about metrics. Would you like to address that?
Sure. The comment that I made was about there was a large federal project several years ago that some of you may remember called Star Metrics, and it was driven by trying to answer a question that former OSTP director Jack Marburger asked, which was, I think, a really important science policy question, which is what fraction of GDP should an industrialized country invest in advanced R&D? It generated a bit of a political firestorm at the time when the question was asked, but it's a good scientific policy question. That project flailed around a good bit. Suresh Garamella and I were both part of this when we were both VPRs in the Big Ten. The Big Ten started a project to pool all of their research expenditure data, not awards, but actual expenditures. So you can see actually where the data was spent, not where it was awarded based on headquarters location, and down even to the level of counties, if you want to go down to that point. That project's now a nonprofit at the University of Michigan called IRIS, and the project's been opened up basically to any institution that wants to join. And there's some really interesting data there. It's since been expanded to fuse with census data, and part of the idea there was to understand not just what the direct expenditure impact was, but what the collateral effects were in terms of job creation because of the investment in basic research. So it's an interesting project. It's incomplete because it's only as good as the data from the member institutions, but it is an interesting place to look at a snapshot that provides some insight into the impact of basic research.
Thanks, Dan. That would give a different view on what's going on at a different level. Suresh G, you're next with a question.
Yes, thank you. I think the data are amazing, and I'm glad the slides will be posted. I guess I have a philosophical question, perhaps, and I don't know if there's a direct answer, but we've been talking in the board about the geography of innovation, and I think this panel is titled Geography of Federal Funding. I was wondering if anyone wanted to comment on the correspondence between those two. Does the geography of innovation correspond to the geography of federal funding? And which is the chicken and which is the egg, or at least what comes first? Thank you.
I'd like to take a go at that.
Well, I'll just state for California, I think there's a very close relationship between federal R&D and innovation. And I do believe the funding comes first, although there's a synergistic relationship that develops after that. But there's no question that without the federal R&D, we wouldn't be the innovation hub that we are.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I'll just comment as well. So, if you look at U.S. federal research investments broadly, the private sector is actually investing most of these resources. And so, looking at the distribution of, industry investment in R&D could, potentially also shed some light onto, sort of innovation broadly, because they are innovating, they are contributing, they are active participants in the innovation ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. Any other panelists, Anna?
Yes, I'd like to comment on that as well. I think that I was tuned into the meeting before our portion of it, and Panch had said that that innovative ideas are everywhere, but opportunity should be everywhere, but isn't. And I think that you really hit on it where you asked about the chicken and the egg piece of it. And I think that at Northern Illinois University, there's certainly many innovative ideas, and there's a lot of capacity for innovation, but it's hard to realize that that potential without funding to do so. And the federal government is such an important partner and player in helping to convert innovative ideas into actual research projects and et cetera. So I think that it is, I would say that the innovation, in my opinion, is spread broadly, but it's a question of how do you have the infrastructure and the mechanics and the ability to harness getting resources to turn your innovative ideas into actual research. That's really, I think, where there's kind of that there can be a disconnect.
And I would just add to what Anna just shared that many regional public universities they know very well what are the issues facing their local communities, where are the areas of strength and potential innovation. But again, because of the funding disparities that they face, it's very hard to realize that. So I can't remember who showed the slide of federal R&D funding by Carnegie classification. Just 1.4% goes to master's degree granting institutions. And as I said, that captures most of the regional public universities. So even if you have a sense of the broader landscape surrounding your campus of potential innovation that could happen, and you don't have that kind of investment to help you be that anchor institution, it makes it very difficult to be a leverage point for innovation regionally.
Okay, thanks, Cecilia. I have Victor, you're next.
Yes, thank you, José-Marie. And this is probably a question to both Marcy and some of your other panelists, particularly when you talked about the RPUs. So when you look at the map and you look at the investments and you see where they're going, if you believe that talent is distributed equally everywhere, but maybe access is not, how do you also lay on that looking at, like, say, technology commercialization, and how do you do that? Some people look at it in terms of number of patents that have come out. Some people look at it in terms of intellectual property disclosures. And to your point with the Northern Illinois, there's a lot of people who have a lot of great ideas there. But, for example, their sponsored program offices are understaffed. They don't have any technology commercialization. I just did a technology commercialization study for DOD, for MSIs. Can you also, with your map that you had, Marcy, also overlay numbers of patents and other things that are attributes to innovation and then be able to show where the gaps are? Because I think that would be compelling to some of the federal agencies who have large amounts of money, not only the federal R&D, but now what are the outputs that we're seeing from that?
Yeah, you absolutely could take some of those outputs, patents, intellectual property disclosures, things like that, and map those. If the data is there and it's rich enough, and that could give you a sense. I'm sure someone at NCSES might be willing to do that kind of analysis for you. It could show some insight into those sorts of things, but I'll let Anna talk about ERIs.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really great question. And so I know that there have been some recent efforts to try and understand the efficiency of innovation. So that's looking at how federal funding gets turned into, or research funding in general. I don't know that it's just federal, gets to, how you translate that into how efficiently you can convert to things like patents and things like that. I can send you a link to that study, or I can follow up with the board staff and make sure that gets to you. I will say that Northern Illinois University was rated, of a mid-sized research institution, we were rated one of the most innovation-efficient institutions in the nation for our ability to convert our funding portfolio into outputs of innovation. But I will send you that link.
Thanks,
So,
Anna.
I just will add one other thing, although Victor has raised a great point, and I do believe one metric is IP and tech transfer. I also want to stress there's other metrics like the economic impact of the IP and tech transfer and the public good. For example, if you develop a drug. So I wouldn't focus just on those, although they are very important. There are other metrics that are equally important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. Economic development, job development, and things like that will come into play. I have Roger Beachy next, and just to let you know, I am paying attention to the hands going up. After you, Roger, I have Art, and then I have Panch.
Thanks, José-Marie. This has really been a fascinating panel, and I appreciate all the comments. I'm especially struck by the RDUs and the emergings and others, and wonder the role that an NSF can play in, for example, the new RFP that was just released on that Panch mentioned earlier today. What's the role what leadership role can institutions like Commerce or like like the NSF or DOE, how can we make this work? We've seen it really most efficiently to engage, because we have this chicken and egg problem that was mentioned by several of us, several of you, and on the discussion, and yet we want to see this happen, as Ponch said, with speed and scale. But we're limited in how we do that because of the R1s and how they happen, and the restriction of innovation going to the economic activity because of the lack of infrastructure of funding, for example, at a local area where there's an RPU. And so how an agency writes an RFP, a research call for proposals for hubs, for example, is really critical to request an engagement. We have the challenge of not being a peanut butter institution, not to just spreads money around everywhere, but spreads it around in the right way to make the most impact. And I think we've learned a lot today, but we have so many more questions that NCSES can help us answer and your comments can. But my first question here is, or final question, I guess, the only question, is how can agencies make this work better?
So you answered, I think, or gave some of the answer I would give in your preamble to your question. But this, for many RPUs, it boils down to infrastructure. They have one person, maybe one person half-time. That's their Office of Grants and Sponsored Research. So when we think about completing a complicated government agency R&D application for funding, it's just completely impossible. So that's where I wonder, and I think there are some agencies that do this, but are there developmental or planning grants that can be given so that they can build out that infrastructure, that then they would be positioned better to go after funding? And then I am intrigued by the idea of R1s partnering with emerging research universities. I would say a lot of RPUs, there's cross-pollination there between those two sectors. Probably a lot of RPUs are also ERIs. So how can larger research institutions, particularly the public ones in the states, particularly ones like Colorado State University, one of our RPUs is part of that system. How can they partner and lend some of the research infrastructure that they have to support their RPU? And that could happen in many systems across the country. So then how can government agencies incentivize those kind of partnerships? That would be another way I could see that infrastructure being improved. I'd be curious to hear what Anna has to say as well, and Roger, given that they're steeped in the ERI work.
Sure. Do you want to go first, Roger? Go ahead. You go first.
Okay. I'll just speak personally. I am so strongly supportive of trying to partner with ERIs to help them with their infrastructure, but one must do so cautiously because, for example, I'm happy if I could just snap my fingers and process research awards at UCLA for ERIs. But what I've been cautioned about is you take on that liability too. You take on the liability for that institution. So that's been the major thing that I've been trying to process in my brain. How do I get over that so that I can reach out and partner very effectively with ERIs? So just to let you know, these are real-time thoughts in my mind, but certainly the will is there. I would love to partner with as many ERIs as possible.
Yeah, and I would just say, the data that I presented and that other panelists presented today show you that, Roger Beachy, you had mentioned kind of a peanut butter model. I mean, to me, it seems like the United States is a piece of toast and it's a very globby peanut butter model, right? It's not evenly spread. When you have 139 institutions that receive literally 90% of federal research funding against thousands of higher education institutions in the country, or even 640 that received any NSF funding reported in the HERD survey for FY 2018. So we're not in a situation where I think we need to be worried about approaching a peanut butter model, right? It will take a lot of time and concerted effort to redirect even 10% of resources, toward institutions that are emerging research institutions right now. So this is definitely a marathon, not a sprint. And I think that on the partnership front, this is why myself and Roger and others have been advocating for partnerships, because you can't just take an institution that isn't, that's receiving, like NIU, we're receiving $2 million a year in FY, the most recent HERD survey, where our NSF portfolio is $2 million a year. You couldn't just give us a $25 million grant, and expect overnight that would be administered. I see Dr. Griffiths, nodding her head too. For my institution listening, of course, we would love to have a $25 million grant. I need to say that, but there are some practical mechanics that have to be done to ramp up to shifting the way that our research resources are distributed across the nation. And so the way that I've been talking about this is meaningful partnerships, because we also, you're really right on, Roger Beachy, with saying we have to be very thoughtful in how an agency incentivizes partnerships. You don't want to get into a situation where a partnership is required, so you end up with a large institution coming to an ERI and saying, we need a partner, so we've already baked the cake, just sign here and we'll give you some money so that you're our partner. You don't want to create that kind of incentive structure. So I think that meaningful partnerships, and what does that look like? I think it could be, commitments to faculty exchanges to build capacity at the ERI. It could be commitment to student research opportunities, exchanges between the ERI and the other, the R1 or the other lead institution. I think it could be, helping the ERI increase its capacity to do grants administration. So I think there's a number of ways that a meaningful partnership could be structured, but I think that that's the key, that creating some expectations and meat around what a partnership is. And I would say, secondly, partnerships are great, but you have to find in other organizations, you have to find institutions to partner with. And so how does a UCLA learn about a Northern Illinois university or a University of Denver or a Dakota State? And so I think that the National Science Foundation could play a really important role and incredibly helpful role in facilitating connections among different types of institutions. One of the wonderful things about the NSF portfolio is that it funds such a broad array of institutions. So finding a way to create almost like I don't want to say matchmaking, but finding a way to create a mechanism where institutions that want to grow their partnerships can learn about the capacities of institutions that maybe aren't in their immediate orbit or in their immediate geography. And I think that also, I'm an astronomer by training, and, a lot of collaborations happen through your network. So that's another thing. You see a lot of horizontal mixing in the research enterprise, but the vertical mixing of different types of institutions is not as prevalent. So that's another way that the NSF could really be helpful, is facilitating kind of vertical mixing among the Carnegie classes of institutions, for example.
Thanks, Anna. Can I one follow-up? When you said there's $2 million of NSF funding to you, are you including all the subcontracts or only the majors? One of the things that Marcy said is there's 10 to 15% unreported in the graphs that she showed because they're subcontracts or they're parts of bigger grants. Is that reflected in your $2 million, or only the award direct awards to NIU?
So I'm reporting the publicly available data through the HERD survey.
It gets to the point that many of us have asked on the board before. How is the spread around? Who are the sub-awardees? And we don't have that information yet. So I don't know how some of our policies can be made without knowing that information. So thanks very much for confirmation.
Yeah, thank you. Artie, over to you.
I'm going to say something controversial. To support a research enterprise at a university, you need relatively low teaching loads. You need an office of sponsored contracts that can handle contracts effectively. You need an effective purchasing system, receiving system. It takes a great deal to do that. When I look at the discrepancy between the RPU funding and the other funding, you can't help but suspect that translates into higher teaching loads, into less infrastructure. Unless the states join us in this endeavor to create a more homogeneous distribution, the federal government can't handle the load on its own. Now, there's one thing where I'll back off from that, and that is, if you look at the institutions that are getting most of that money, either they're getting good state support or they have high endowments and high gifts. Part of the reason that support is needed is that the federal government itself does not cover the cost of administering the grants that it provides, the cap on indirect cost rate. Now that tends to concentrate the research in those universities that can supplement the indirect cost income with gifts, endowment, or state support. The federal government should recognize that it's leading with its policies towards part of the problem. And with that, I'll quit.
I don't think it's controversial at all. You're stating facts. This is the reality that RPUs exist in. And so it's kind of one of those things where wealth begets wealth when you're a wealthy institution with a large endowment. And I mean, Stanford University just got a $1.1 billion gift. Imagine if that had been spread across the 430 RPUs in the country. Each would have received around 3 million. And so it's these kind of compounding factors that create limitations on these institutions. So I absolutely agree. There's likely a role for federal state partnerships. Texas is a really interesting example. They had their Emerging Research University initiative that seems to be fairly successful. They devoted resources in combination with federal R&D funding to help support the creation of research infrastructure in RPUs across that state. So that's an interesting test case. The other thing I would say is that a number of RPUs, to try and address the teaching load issue that you raised, which is very real, have created research professor lines that have been trying to mimic more of what an R1 research or professor's teaching load would look like. And there's been some success in that space because they've had more time and capacity to go after the large grants. In those spaces, there have also been some additions to staff to support grants and sponsored research, but they're, it's David and Goliath. They're just not able at this point, given these compounding funding inequities that come from private gifts, from state appropriations, from other types of federal funding, to make up that difference. And so, no, I don't think NSF can fix all of this, but I do think they have a role to play.
Can I jump in on that as well? Artie, I agree with what you've said and what Cecilia has said. And I think that's why one of the reasons that I showed the Pell recipient data for emerging research institutions. So 2/3 of Pell recipients who attend a research active institution in the United States attend an emerging research institution. So you're starting from a student base that is, financially behind many of the students that attend a non-emerging research institution. And so that has consequences for advancement and that type of thing. So I just wanted to highlight that as well.
Okay.
Can I just step in and say that on a different issue, I have been strongly urging vast increases in the Pell Grant. It's just too low and should be returned to something like 70 to 90% of the cost of attending college.
Thank you. We need that too. Panch, you're next.
Thank you all, José-Marie, Marcy, Roger, Cecilia, and Anna. Great presentations. So I want to start with that first, and great discussion, by the way. I wanted to sort of turn this around a little bit. When Suresh asked the question about innovation, let's first start with innovators. Innovation happens because of innovators, okay? So which means that innovators need to be scaled, and that doesn't just happen only because of federal investments for research only. It goes through the entire spectrum. I was hoping to hear that Some of you weigh in on that too. It starts with a K-12 system, community college system. I mean, there are so many pathways for innovators. I mean, in my travels, I have found, for example, in Kansas the other day with Johnson's Community College, I was just amazed by the innovators that were there in the community college. So let's not forget that, which means that the education department, state government investments in education in K-12, Pell Grants, of course, was mentioned, and a whole host of others need to come together. So I just want to make that point first. The agony that Cecilia and Anna started about not having the research infrastructure, I cannot agree with you more. And having seen that firsthand, what difference it makes. Since coming in, I'm happy to share with you that we are now launching a program called Granted, Growing Research Access for Nationally Transformative Equity and Diversity. It's a clever acronym, and one of our fantastic ADs, Alicia Needler, who leads our Office of Integrative Activities, came up with the acronym, and Alicia has also got on-the-ground personal experience in this area. So I'm delighted to report that this is targeted at providing a virtual research office for proposal development, pre-award, post-award kind of support that can be accessible for not only institutions that need it, but also individuals that need it. So I'm proud to say that we have launched it, and for the FY23 budget request, we have asked for $50 million. And so all of you should be mindful of the fact that we are working towards that. The third thing that I want to talk about is partnerships. And I'm glad you mentioned the word partnerships, and partnership with commerce, partnership between institutions. In fact, I have often in my comments said that it is not just enough an R1 institution leads. We have many programs at NSF, which essentially motivates and encourages partnership from R2 and other MSI institutions. Many programs, but we need to do more. But also what we need to happen, which I'm emphasizing, is that yes, R1 leads, R2 and ERIs can be partners, but it should flip, and ERIs should lead and R1 should be partners. We need to get to that. And how do we get to that? Again, granted program and other mechanisms need to be at a level of intensity that can make possible leading happening from those kinds of institutions. And so that's about research, partnerships, and infrastructures that was talked about. And I would strongly encourage you to check out the Build and Broaden program by our fantastic Social Behavioral Economic Sciences Directorate. Kelly is here. She reminded me about that. And thank you, Kelly, for all the work that you all do in SBE. And I think that's a great program. And I will leave with the last comment. The BAA that was issued 2 days ago, which I talked about on technology innovation partnerships, Irvin will tell you that it is about equity for R1 and ERIs. And so I want you all to take note of that. So NSF is working hard at ensuring that innovators everywhere are inspired and enabled so that innovation can happen anywhere.
Thank you, Panch. Congratulations on the granted. I'm sure we'll all be looking at that. We're running up against time. Vic, you had your hand up. You have a quick question, and then perhaps we'll have one answer before we finish.
Well, actually, what I was going to talk to is Cecilia, but I think Director Panchanathan has beat me to the punch in the sense that maybe while that is coming along, what many of the other organizations are doing, particularly like the HBCUs, there is a circle of VPRs, are working together, because why should you go out in your RPUs and hire a technology commercialization expert for each one? That's particularly for your size, that's just too much redundancy. Can you think about organizing together to put together to do technology commercialization, as well as people that can help you with post-award research administration? So I'm so glad to hear that Director Panchanathan has already beat me to the punch on that. But I would say the next thing to do is now work with other agencies who are also doing that. So NIH has a program called SPAD. Even though I'm here for NSB, I'm going to promote them because you all can get that, and they will fund people in your sponsored program offices and trying to promote biomedical research. And then the next thing I would ask you to do, because not only can NSF facilitate, but you can help facilitate us by bringing those people together for us and bringing them in the room. And with that, I want to say thank you, José-Marie Griffiths, and to all the panelists for your timely expertise. This will surely inform the board as we move forward in our efforts to expand the geography of innovation. Roger, you have done it again. Thank you very much. The NSBO staff, Alex.
Yeah, I wanted to highlight the NSBO staff.
And the NSBO staff, Alexandra, Nadine, for coordinating and arranging this session. This has been really fantastic.